Good afternoon, everyone. At the end of the line, Students Helping Students is the title of my talk. I wonder what images come to mind when you hear the word student. There may be the stereotypical ones of long-haired, bearded young men and mini-skirted young women who drink and party a great deal, dabble in drugs, and who sit up half the night philosophizing about the state of the world. What perhaps we don't see are intelligent young people gradually feeling their way into adulthood. Some find it easy, some don't. What I would like to talk about today is an extremely valuable organisation, London Nightline, which was set up by students for those students who don't find it easy, and why that might be. It's quite a remarkable coincidence that I've been asked to give this lecture about the work of London Nightline, as this year we are celebrating 40 years of London Nightline's existence. We're planning a gala dinner in June for current and past volunteers, coordinators, trustees and patrons. It's an even more remarkable coincidence that today, the 21st of March 2011, is exactly the 40th anniversary of when of what was then known as Imperial College Nightline opened its doors on the 21st of March 1971. They began in a room at number 8 Prince's Gardens in southwest London. The impetus for the establishment of an out-of-hours service during term time, which would allow students to be able to talk to someone when existing college counselling services were closed, was the tragic death by suicide of 3 Imperial College students during the previous year. 1 year earlier, in 1970, the first Nightline was established at Essex University, and one of its founding members, Geoffrey Hoskin, is in the audience today. Nightline was, and still is, an organisation run by students for students who offer out-of-hours, non-judgemental listening to any student who makes contact, either by telephone or online. Initially, Nightline was known as West London Nightline and consisted of Imperial College, the Royal College of Music, King's College London, LSE, and University College London. As time went on, and other universities and colleges in London came to appreciate and value the work that Nightline was doing, so the organisation gradually evolved into a London-wide service, as did its structure and organisation. In 1985, the steering committee was formed, and I was asked to be its first chair. In 1990, it moved from its original site in South Kensington to renting premises at the University of London Union in Mallet Street, where its name changed to London Nightline at ULU, and where it is still located today. To date, there are 34 colleges and universities affiliated to London Nightline, and 23 students' unions. In 1993, we became the first Nightline in the country to attain charitable status, and in line with Nightline's increasing professionalism, the post of coordinator was made full-time, the salary being linked to students' union sabbatical pay in order to reflect the increasing responsibilities of the job. Funding comes from a 30p per full-time capita contribution from the affiliated colleges and universities, and 10p per capita from the students' unions. The day-to-day running of Nightline is left to the coordinator, who tends to be either a recent graduate or a final year student who has deferred their course for a year. All potential coordinators have to have considerable experience as a volunteer in order to be considered and interviewed for the post. The coordinator is answerable to the Board of Trustees and reports each term to the steering committee, which consists of representatives from each of the affiliated universities and colleges, students' unions and the trustees. In addition, a number of volunteers with particular responsibility for such matters as social events, online services, policy and procedures, training, etc., make up the executive committee, which meets with the coordinator twice a term, in addition to attending termly steering committee meetings. We are particularly fortunate in our current patrons, who are Rabbi Lionel Blue, David Blunkett MP, David Lammy MP, Joe Brand, comedian, and Mrs. Doreen Hewell, former trustee and founder member of London Nightline. At the moment, Nightline is solvent, but this hasn't always been the case. 1995-6, Nightline's Jubilee year was celebrated with a huge fundraising and awareness campaign which enormously increased Nightline's profile. One spin-off of the stylish and instantly recognisable advertising campaign and logo was free advertising in Time Out and London Student. Over the last 40 years, Nightline has continued to go from strength to strength. The achievement in 1999 of the quality standard for helplines under the auspices of the Telephone Helpline Association, the introduction of email listening in 2000, the establishment of the online listening service in 2009, and involvement in the University Suicide Prevention Initiative have strengthened our profile and ensured that London Nightline at ULU is a professional organisation committed to providing a high standard of training and support to volunteers, and therefore a high standard of service to callers. All of these achievements, however, would not be possible without the army of student volunteers whose support and dedication over the years have kept the service going. They are indeed the backbone of Nightline, as are the truly creative and gifted coordinators who each year continue to impress the steering committee with their initiative, ideas and suggestions for improving the service. Over the years, Nightline has broadened its scope and image. Having been established with the help of the Samaritans, with similar guidelines and policies, it has developed from being an organisation to contact if a student were feeling suicidal and despairing, which is still the case, to one which is run by students for students who ring for a whole variety of reasons, as these charts show. First chart shows the number of calls per day between September and May for the last 3 years, from 2007 up to 2010. And you can see from the chart that the busiest time that year was September, not surprisingly when students are coming to university, many of them for the first time. The next graph shows the call time per day in minutes, again between September and May for the last 3 years. And you can see in certainly 2009-10, the last academic year, there were a huge number of calls in September. The call topics, they tend to be the same, and they also reflect, interestingly, the largest number of presenting problems which students come to, certainly our counselling service at King's with. Depression, loneliness, bereavement makes up 22%, followed by academic concerns, other queries related to welfare, gender, sexuality, health, maybe entertainment, more serious ones relating to suicidal ideation, eating disorders, self-harm, sexual relationships, etc. The number of emails for the last 3 years, again, you can see that in that year, in January 2007, the largest number came through. We haven't got the number for May of last year. I'm not quite sure why that is. I need to check with the coordinator when I go back. And the email topics, again, one can see that depression, loneliness, bereavement make up the majority of topics, followed by academic. And again, you can see the constellation of other concerns that students have. The total number of online listening calls, which has only been going for a year, again in the last year, November, for some reason, was the busiest month. And the online listening call time in minutes, not surprisingly, September again had the most number of calls. And the online listening topics again reflect what we've already seen: depression, loneliness, bereavement, academic, and the other reasons are again more or less in the same proportion as they are on the telephone. Students aren't asked which institution they come from. It's obviously entirely anonymous. Some choose to say which institution, about 5% indicate, and of that 5%, there's a breakdown of where most of them might come from. University of Westminster, top solicitor, Kingston University, you can see Imperial, and lots of the students, but by no means all who are affiliated to Nightline. Okay. Every year the coordinator attends what are called Freshers' Fairs. These are fairs organised by the individual university and colleges' students' unions to showcase the wide variety of clubs and societies students can join. Each year, approximately 100 prospective volunteers go through a selection and training process. Pre-selection training is split into 3-hour sessions that are generally made up of group work, discussions and role plays, which include the skills needed to properly take a call or deal with a query online, how to handle difficult calls, abusive, repeat and suicidal callers, which can be very distressing. Nightline usually takes on 40 to 45 new volunteers each year, depending on how many volunteers have been retained from the previous year. So altogether, there would be perhaps 65 to 75 volunteers offering their services. After the new volunteers have been selected, there is a further weekend of training which is compulsory for all new and returning volunteers. There are then 3 compulsory top-up training sessions, one in December, one in January, one in March. The third time is avoided due to examinations. Those who are taken on as volunteers are required to do 12 overnight duties per year, that is 4 a term. It is current policy for 3 volunteers to do a duty together. The premises which London Nightline occupies at ULU has beds, a kitchen and a shower, so that volunteers whose duty begins at 6 p.m. and ends at 8 a.m. can get ready, breakfast and go straight to lectures. Support for volunteers is one of the most important aspects of Nightline, as dealing with calls, either by telephone or online, can be an emotionally draining experience. All calls are confidential within Nightline, that is, confidential between caller and the organisation, not between caller and individual volunteers. Volunteers are encouraged to talk about the calls they have had, especially if a call has been upsetting. Volunteer welfare is of the utmost importance during a shift, and in extreme cases this will take precedence over answering calls. After all, if a volunteer has been very upset by a call they have dealt with, they will not be able to deliver a good service to other callers. When logging call statistics at the end of a shift, volunteers are given an opportunity to write down how they felt about a call. This is effective both in encouraging volunteers to debrief and allowing the coordinator and members of the executive committee to contact volunteers to check that they are feeling okay following a difficult call and to identify whether or not any further support is needed. As part of its carefully selected support system, Nightline ensures that each new volunteer is allocated an experienced volunteer as a support buddy. Their first shift will be completed with this person, and subsequently they will keep in touch with them at least once a term. A volunteer's first port of call is their support buddy if they want to discuss any aspect of volunteering. London Nightline also has a support officer on the executive committee who keeps in regular contact with volunteers and acts as a support buddy to the support buddies. The Nightline coordinator is on call 24 hours a day during term time. Volunteers can call any time of day, or particularly at night, for both technical and practical queries and for emotional support. London Nightline also operates a drop-in policy in the office, which means that volunteers can call in at any time to talk about any aspect of Nightline. This can be particularly useful for those calls that continue to be disturbing a few days after a difficult duty. We need to remember that volunteers may be going through some of the same pressures and stresses as the callers. Many of them have had difficult times in the past, and it is these experiences which have often inspired them to volunteer for Nightline. So, why is a service like Nightline needed? As you have seen from the charts, Nightline volunteers deal each year with an increasingly large number of calls, some of whom have very worrying problems. Why is this, and why do university counselling services throughout the country report an exponential rise in the numbers of students contacting their services with increasingly worrying problems? In January 2003, the Royal College of Psychiatrists published a report entitled "The Mental Health of Students in Higher Education." According to this report, the increasing number of students presenting with mental health problems reflects the rapidly increasing access of young people to higher education and the associated growth in student numbers. It also reflects the growing rates of mental health problems among young people generally. The report said that given the trends in the general population, it is hardly surprising that the rates of psychological disturbance and psychiatric illness among students were rising. The available research suggests that students report increased symptoms of mental ill health compared with age-matched controls. However, according to the report, there is no empirical evidence to confirm that students are more likely to suffer diagnosable mental disorder or illness than the age-matched non-student population. It is also essential to differentiate severe mental disorder or illness from less severe conditions, as their management and potential implications for continued study are likely to be different. Contributing factors to the increase are cited by the report as moving away from home, family and childhood friends, to an unfamiliar place and culture. This is particularly true of students from overseas, as additional challenges at an age when most students are also negotiating and consolidating significant developmental changes. Thus, if for whatever reason the young person fears growing up, being sexually potent, leaving his or her parents, then he or she may neglect their appearance, attack their body suicidally by anorexia or abuse of drugs. They may neglect their work, avoid contact with peers, or deny sexual interest in either sex. The normal developmental processes of late adolescence, which are characterized by change, transition, and sometimes risk-taking behavior, are therefore going to overlap with being a student, so that the academic and social commitments, which are essential to university life, force a student into facing those developmental issues which will cause difficulties if the student is not ready to tackle them. For most young people entering university, there is an abrupt change from a tightly structured school curriculum to one where they are responsible for structuring their own hours of study. From having been a biggish fish in a small known pond to a very small fish in a frighteningly large pond, from having been thought of as a teenager, the young person is now assumed to be adult. Having had a family to fall back on, he or she is suddenly left without adults monitoring his or her safety. Similarly, the values and behaviour of other students may appear very strange. Teaching methods and subjects are very new. Some may have idealised the course before arrival and come with wildly unrealistic expectations, only to be disappointed. Many students feel ashamed to admit any concern about whether or not they are able to cope and look around for someone else to blame. A rotten course, boring lectures, lousy teaching. Some may be ashamed about feeling inadequate or appearing vulnerable, fearing that it will be held against them. This is particularly true in more explicitly vocational courses such as medicine. Some admit to homesickness, feeling that nothing will ever be the same again. The young person going to university is therefore undergoing very major life changes, from adolescence to adulthood, from living within a family to being very much left to his or her own devices. The individual thus experiences the loss of an external structure, which inevitably places a severe test on the stability of their internal structure. For some, the change and the losses involved may be very painful and difficult, whilst for others it may be overwhelming. Under such circumstances, the anxiety which accompanies change and the strain of staying with the psychic pain of loss, of having to find oneself as an individual within a new setting, whilst yet retaining the capacity to be open to new experiences and knowledge, may be too great. Students may break down, drop out, or be easily tempted into the various sensuous escape routes, such as drowning their sorrows in drink, drugging themselves into oblivion, or plunging into a hectic social and sexual life to make up for or sidestep the sheer terror of failing the course, academic competition, or dealing with authority figures. Others may give up their attempt to master social and sexual fears by over-diligent studying, complaining that they have too much work to do to join in the social life of the college. Many of these students may well find their way to the University Student Counselling Service or telephone their University Nightline, but by no means all who are deeply unhappy or at risk will have the courage to seek help. Because he or she is supposed to be an adult, the student may not feel entitled to seek the help they need, or alternatively feel it is shameful to need it. So the young person may try to act in a preconceived, so-called adult way, and pretend there is nothing wrong, sometimes at great cost. Parents may react in one of two ways. Either they may feel inhibited about visiting or phoning for fear they are conveying their own anxieties and will be thought to be intruding into their offspring's freedom. This, of course, can lead to the young person feeling forgotten and uncared for. Alternatively, parents may become overprotective. These are known as helicopter parents, not allowing their son or daughter to find their own feet, make a few mistakes, or treating their offspring as if they were brains rather than as persons with troubled and searching minds. As a result, students can feel very lonely and may come to rely for support exclusively on members of their peer group. They may be lucky enough to find good, reliable friends, but out of loneliness may quite easily be drawn into less helpful adolescent cultures. All of this happens within an atmosphere and an environment which tends to stress achievement at the expense of thoughtfulness, and where the overthrowing of value systems often parades as open-mindedness. For some students, the issue is even more fundamental. They are not entirely sure why they are at university or medical school. They have hardly begun to separate themselves physically or emotionally from their parents. Prior to entering higher education, they may have followed their parents' directions. For years, university may have been their parentally inspired goal, so that some enroll on a course, often vocational, of their parents' choice, when their own natural inclinations, of which they are perhaps unaware, lie in other directions. When they arrive, the freedom of higher education allows them, perhaps for the first time, to question parental choices, leading both to rebellion and to guilt. Many may be ambivalent about their chosen subject, which is seen as an arbitrary choice, and their aimlessness may betray a very real need to find an academic or personal direction. Work, therefore, becomes of lesser importance. For some students, the only way to rebel successfully against their parents and authority figures is to fail. Academic failure becomes a successful subversion and a displacement from other grievances. For instance, the getting of a degree or qualifying as a doctor or dentist may be a gift for the parents to repay them for all they have done. But if the student harbours grievances and resentment, not uncommon at this age, and indeed occasionally to be welcomed as a way of separating from the parents, then the gift will not be quite so straightforward and simple. Therefore, the unconscious wish to fail is an important issue for some students who present for help, because they are worried that their work is not going well, and they are afraid of failing. In fact, when one explores what is going on, they are often unconsciously more concerned about succeeding than failing. The unconscious wish to fail and the subsequent fear of success often presents difficulties for the brighter students rather than the less able ones. An example of this developmental unconscious wish to fail was a first-year female history student who had prepared well for her exams, had high marks for her coursework, and seemed all set to do well. In the exam, her mind had gone blank. Underlying this meaningless self-destructiveness was a pervasive form of self-preservation. Deep down, she was terrified of adulthood and adult social relationships. Passing her exams meant that she would have to socialize throughout the summer vacation. If she had to resit, she could avoid social life with the excuse that she had to study. She was sabotaging her potential academic success to avoid social and emotional development. Of course, the converse is also possible. If students achieve academic brilliance despite their unhappiness, it may well be at the expense of their emotional and social life. This is also a factor, particularly during finals, when the student's unconscious fear is that to be successful will force them to leave college and enter the adult world. Medical students, for example, coming up to finals frequently complain of how unprepared they feel to be qualifying, how poor the course has been, and of course how terrified they are of not knowing enough and of killing a patient. Another feature of this unconscious wish to fail is academic paralysis. A young male Asian medical student whose ambitious driving parents had pushed him to go to medical school talked at one level of wanting very much to become a doctor, but on another level the degree represented a capitulation to demanding parents whom he resented. He felt obliged to please his parents after all they had done for him, but was aware of his guilt about the sacrifices they had made for him and never allowed him to stand up or separate from them. He had never had a girlfriend, thinking his parents would be devastated if he did, and would feel that this would distract him from his studies. Failing his medical degree or leaving and getting involved in a sexual relationship were the two things he both wanted and yet feared most, because both represented a decisive break from his previous pattern of emotional dependence on his parents. He wanted to break this pattern and yet was terrified of it. The synthesis of all this was academic paralysis. It is worth mentioning at this point that examinations can be seen as rites of passage, and if students are ambivalent or anxious about their own development, this will to some extent be reflected in their examination performance. Similarly, where personal self-esteem or self-worth is entirely dependent on academic achievement, particularly if they come from backgrounds where academic success has been considered very important and heavily rewarded, often to the exclusion of everything else, one can often find that when inevitably work stops going well, those students who have used their intellect to hold themselves together become very depressed and are apathetic because so much of their self-worth is identified with how well they perform academically. In addition to these psychological developmental processes, which may affect all students, regardless of their socioeconomic backgrounds, there are other problematic issues which affect students. Widening participation has resulted in increasing numbers of students coming to university who may come from backgrounds where going to university was not seen as a realistic option, or where they might be thought of as above themselves. In addition, there are those students with a disability, either physical or psychological, who have particular needs requiring specialist support. There are students, either indigenous or from overseas, whose ethnic or cultural background may make it very difficult for them to integrate or ask for help if they are in difficulty. Another group is, of course, mature students, particularly in vocational subjects such as nursing, who are predominantly female and who are often juggling a home and children, as well as anxieties about whether they are going to be able to cope with the demands of academia after a long absence from formal education. Financial problems are another major stress-inducing factor for all students to contend with. Even before the coalition government's intention to treble student fees, university welfare advice services were already seeing increasing numbers of students struggling to make ends meet, having to juggle a job along with their studies and often leaving university many thousands of pounds in debt. We forget that one of the reasons American university undergraduate courses take 4 years is because there is a culture of students working their way through university. Our university 3-year undergraduate courses don't make allowances for students having jobs. Is this something that will have to change? In addition, the economic recession means that there is no longer a guarantee of a job for a graduate at the end of their academic and financial endeavours. For many disadvantaged students, however, the emotional, material, financial adversity and personal experiences of failure they may have experienced in growing up can mean that they encounter difficulties adjusting to university life and to the expectations and demands placed on them. It can be difficult for such students to adjust to the predominantly middle-class environment of university and to being with a more privileged group of students, some of whom will have more money, better parental support, more material possessions, or a marked sense of confidence and self-worth. For some students, these differences may lead to a feeling of inferiority and a sense of shame for who they are and from where they come from. Some may try to hide these feelings by blagging, by pretending to know more than they do or to own more than they have. Another reaction might be to pretend they come from a different background. Some students describe feeling like an outsider, the observer of a situation where they don't know what's going on or they don't know the rules in terms of how university life is organised and how to make their mark. It should always be remembered that learning is not just a cognitive process, it is also an emotional experience, so that many feelings or behaviours that indicate an inability to understand, to concentrate or retain what is being taught or learned, an inability to meet deadlines, a need to be guarded and self-protective, to be overly critical or argumentative, may mean that the individual needs help in order to work through those personal experiences, memories and feelings which are preoccupying their thoughts and capacity to concentrate on their academic work. For all of the reasons I have mentioned, it is vital that universities have structures in place such as health centres, counselling services, welfare and disability advisors and tutorial systems in order to give students the support, help, treatment and guidance they need in order to achieve their potential. But in the middle of the night, when everything looks bleak and all these services are closed, there is Nightline. Although London Nightline, I believe, is the second oldest, largest and most well established of the Nightline services, most large universities now have a Nightline service, and a national Nightline coordinating service has been established. I think you will agree, however, that in this 40th anniversary year of the establishment of London Nightline, whilst we celebrate the work it has done and the thousands of students who have been helped by the existence of London Nightline, that the need for its and other Nightlines' existence has never been so vital. I'd just like to end by highlighting some of the comments from Nightline users over the years. Some saying, fantastic service, slightly frustrating not being able to ask for an opinion on things. However, I could appreciate why you can't. I thought the online chat service is the best. The anonymity of online chat made me feel much more free to talk about issues. I'm really glad there are students out there volunteering their services on this line. With help from Nightline, students like me who have little peer support on certain issues can find a listening ear, and that makes problems easier to deal with. Incredibly helpful, the most polite help you'll probably get at a ridiculous o'clock in the morning. And the person on the phone was very friendly and listened well, as I do tend to go on about things a lot. Overall, I was very satisfied with the service provided. Very good listeners, non-judgemental, they're doing great work. Highly recommend to anyone in need. Thank you.
Are you prepared to take any questions?
Yes, absolutely, yes, sure.
Well, I thought I knew something about Nightline until now. I realised I knew absolutely nothing. And I think I played the same with most of us here. Now, Anne has agreed to answer some questions, and well, there are plenty of them. So there's one question here first. Thank you.
You mentioned the need to give support to the student counsellor after a difficult call, even if that meant you missed calls. I wonder if you have an issue, or if there is a problem with you having to miss calls because there are more than you can cope with, for example.
Well, that's why at London Nightline, 3 volunteers man the phones every evening. So that if one person did have a very distressed or distressing call, the other 2 can take over. But obviously, everyone is human, everyone is vulnerable, and if someone has been particularly upset, shall we say, by maybe a suicidal caller, that needs to be addressed. But there are others who can continue to man the phones.
Lauren, have you? Oh, there we are. It's always the same. It's always the other side of the room.
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you. I wondered what was the experience of the volunteers themselves. What do they feel about the Nightline service, and do they gain something from it?
Yes, I think they do, actually. And what is interesting is that some of them volunteer for the whole 3 years of their undergraduate studies. And I think for some, I mean, one has to acknowledge that they may have their own difficulties, which vicariously they may be, if you like, working through by helping others. That always has to be acknowledged. But I think the feeling of being able to give something to somebody else just by listening to them and trying to understand what they're saying is, I think, enormously rewarding in itself. And I think that, as I say, the fact that so many do continue to be a volunteer throughout their time at university is testament in itself to what they get from it.
Yes, as a father of a former volunteer, I knew the emotional feelings that she had with this, and she never discussed anything outside, even with me, her father. And so it's very difficult that you're inside yourself, it's all to yourself there. Your immediate family are excluded.
Yes.
They've got to be. Your friends also presumed are excluded.
Yes.
It makes you a very interesting person indeed. So, sorry, that was a bad deal with that particular
Well,
question.
I think if I can just emphasise in relation to that comment, that's why it is important that there is a support structure which allows them to debrief with others who will understand the experience that they've had. That is very important.
It's right by you. Gosh, that was the first time it's ever happened in my experience.
Are the volunteers empowered or able to refer troubled students to other organisations or medical support lines or any other area of help and support, if need be?
Yes, they can. This has to be done obviously very carefully, because the whole idea is that it's a non-judgemental and non-opinionated service. But certainly, in the course of the conversation, if, for example, should we say a student were feeling very suicidal, it might be suggested that they might like to go to either A&E or to their doctor or to a counselling service, or indeed might like to contact. Sometimes, for example, under 18-year-olds will just ring the service, who they may not actually be a university student, and they can be referred to an organisation called Papyrus, which offers a similar service to under 18-year-olds, and indeed to 18-year-olds as well. So yes, that can be, without being told you must do this, those suggestions can be made, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. This question doesn't relate so much to the service you provide as the picture that you painted in your talk of the contemporary London University, which is, I think, sort of the best description I've heard of what's going on, which is that through both widening participation in various ways, as you say, and also the very international nature of university colleges in London. I work at the LSE, and what you were describing I saw as very, very true. Our universities are very, very diverse, very fragmented, and there's lots and lots of people who fall through gaps. And it seems to me, certainly at LSE, that national and sort of cultural societies are often ones that are providing the network of support for people, which isn't necessarily found just among friends on the course, or perhaps faith societies as well. There's different kinds of groupings that are providing people with their network of support. And I think something I struggle with a little bit at the LSE is to work out what we as an institution, how we can strengthen the ways in which students can encounter friends and build up those networks of support that would hopefully make it less likely that they'd need to use your service. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about, what we should be doing.
Yes, it's a very difficult one, actually. I think certainly for those students who are particularly troubled and who just, friends who will listen, it isn't enough. They need some professional help. It is terribly important that they are able to come through to counselling service with experienced and professionals who can help them. But I think the things you've mentioned, most universities do have a whole range of clubs and societies, and a lot of them will be related to different ethnic groupings. But I think it's also good for students to meet, if they are from overseas, to meet the indigenous students as well. So I think encouragement of them joining any club or society that they may just be interested in, where they will meet others, is terribly important. Other than that, it's very difficult, particularly in a city like London, although, of course, students at London University are lucky in that there are not just the clubs and societies within their own particular college, like LSE or King's or UCL, but they can use the London University network of clubs and societies as well. And I think just encourage them to make as many friends as they can on their course and in their halls of residence. Most students manage that, actually. It's those who may have a particular issue who find it very difficult. But the majority do manage, or else we would be completely flooded out, more so than we are. We are talking here about a minority within the whole constellation of students, fortunately. But it is a significant minority.
Can I take on from that?
Yes.
In your 25 years experience, things have changed totally, and certainly when I was a student, and many of us here, the bar was the place you met people. Mm-hmm. And that's because we are more or less the same sort of social grouping. Mm. But with a change in this grouping, and particularly ethnic groups, that bar no longer exists as such. Sure. So the bar becomes somewhere where people get drunk, and to other people don't come. Is that a serious problem or a perceived one?
I think it's probably a realistic one. I think not all students probably get drunk in the bar, but I do know a fair number do. And I think it is a serious issue, actually, in that in our society generally, if one thinks of sometimes, departments, tutors holding receptions for new students, and there are obviously soft drinks, but a lot of our socialising is around alcohol, actually, and that can obviously be problematic for students from an Islamic background. But I think that students' unions, my impression is, are more conscious of this, actually, and do make sure that in social gatherings that there are non-alcoholic drinks and that the whole thing isn't centred around the bar. But it is, I think, a problem in society in general.
Can I have another one, by the way? The figures, the pie charts, I don't often get a chance to do this because normally at 2 o'clock I have to say you must all get out of here very quickly, and that doesn't make me popular. The pie charts you showed, in fact, showed that the number of worries about academic matters was, I would have thought, relatively low. Is that because we, as academics, deal with our problems on the way, or is it just that it works out that way?
Well, it depends, actually. I mean, sometimes we have a distinction in our service between presenting problems and diagnostic problems. And sometimes the presenting problem can be, I'm not coping with my work, whereas underneath that, there can be a whole plethora of issues as to why they're not, because most students who get to university are well able intellectually to be able to cope. Why they're not functioning can be not just, it isn't usually due to their intellectual inabilities, it is due to the emotional problems, which is why I said that learning is not just a cognitive process. Emotions play a huge part too, and that has to be addressed.
Sorry, here in the front row. Right down to the front here.
Thank you. This relates to the student satisfaction survey, and while I appreciate from one of the pie charts that you don't ask people where they come from, but with the student satisfaction survey, how disaggregated is it so that you can find out whether people are in fact upset with Professor Cox but won't tell anybody, or whether people have got emotional problems that are not academic based? Is the survey of any use to you in these services?
I don't think it is, actually. No. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Tim.
Yes, I wonder whether the increase in the use of something like Nightline
is reflected at all in the way in which the additional pressure of student numbers has made departments move away from traditional structures like personal tutoring or open door policies.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always rather worried at the number of departments which have office hours which consist of 1 hour on 1 day a week, and one can always assume that the problem arises outside of that hour. To what extent do you liaise with individual colleges about the sort of inquiries that you're getting from individual students?
That isn't a policy of Nightline at all, actually, to do that, because the anonymity of the callers have to be preserved. But Nightline wouldn't actually do that. But there's an annual report every year which goes to all the affiliated colleges and universities. So, and the statistics, will be provided. But because only 5% is known about, it wouldn't be a fair reflection of where the students come from. But I think on a wider scale, I think it is a difficulty because all institutions, higher education institutions, have grown exponentially, as I mentioned, and so therefore tutors, academics are much more hard-pressed than they used to be to provide more individual liaison with their students. But there are also the pressures of wider society too, actually. So it's very difficult when I'm often asked, well, why are more students coming through to services like yours? And this is nationwide. This isn't just London. And I think it's a mixture of factors. I always say that universities are a microcosm of society, and the pressures and anxieties one sees in society are going to be reflected within the institution, and particularly the current economic situation, the whole fee system. The fact that students are going to be leaving even more in debt than they are currently is really going to be is proving very problematic. And I think where nightlines and counselling services will be even busier than they already are, unfortunately.
I wonder whether one of your aims would be to influence social policy in view of the problems that the students face. And one would spring to mind, and I would like to mention to you as an example. I have seen that students have a great difficulty in finding accommodation, especially in London. And the motto is that we do not rent to students. Is that a problem that you come across, and as a result of that, and your statistics and all these things, this is only an example that I mentioned, but I mean, are you in a position to influence social policy as a result of your work and the problems that you face through nightlife with students?
Well, as I've just said, the annual report will go to the affiliated colleges and universities. Accommodation, interestingly, isn't an issue that comes up, actually. It's certainly not reflected in the statistics. And most universities that I know of do have what they call an accommodation office. And most universities will have their own halls of residence, and they will have a whole list of accommodation in the private sector, which will help them, will help students rather get accommodation. So on the whole, that's tackled by the constituent college or university. But in general, in terms of influencing social policy, it will be through the annual report that sent to the heads of the institutions. If they read it, they will see the kind of issues that are coming up. And certainly my own annual report, which is distributed to all the significant people at King's College London, hopefully has some impact. One can only hope.
Thank you. I wonder whether you can say anything about the kinds of students who volunteer. I was thinking back to my own experience, and of the students in the first cohort at Essex, 2 had physical disabilities, 2 had been bereaved recently, 1 had called the Samaritans, and 2 were from abroad and were sort of having to make their way in a new country. So we all had a lot of needs, but then we volunteered. So what are students like now, the volunteers?
I think there are a whole range of volunteers, actually. Obviously, it's the coordinator, not myself, who is part of the selection process. But as I mentioned, I think some students will vicariously be wanting to volunteer as a way of perhaps resolving their own problems. Others will be perfectly, well-balanced and fine. But there will be a whole mixture. Within 80-odd students a year, certainly in London Nightline, there will be a whole range. And in fact, there is a whole range in terms of ethnic backgrounds too, which is also very good.
You've exhausted everybody, but it gives me a minute or two. When I was a young lecturer, it did happen many years ago, I was working in my laboratory late one evening, and the door opened, and a student came who'd graduated a couple of years before, and vaguely recognised him, and he said, "Would you like to come for a drink?" And there used to be a little bar next to King's in those days, you probably remember that. So we went there, we had a drink, and he chatted, and he told me his project, his PhD project, wasn't going particularly well, and we had overlapping interests, so we chatted, and then he said, "Can I talk to you about this?" And I said, "Well, yes, sometime," and thought no more about it. And I met him 10 years later at an international congress in Australia, and he picked me up and said, "That night you came to see me, I just walked across Waterloo Bridge. My project wasn't going well, the grant had gone down, my girlfriend had died of leukemia, and my parents had gone to Australia." And I thought, this is the easiest thing in the world now. So I walked across the bridge, and I suddenly remembered your tutorials. And you used to sit there and listen. And he said, "I remember that, and thank you very much indeed. I owe you a drink." I think he owes me more than that, and I owe him a lot more than that.
Yeah.
So, but all of us can be in that position.
Absolutely.
We don't know if it would have happened, but I always remember that. And since that time, when I was head of the department, the instruction was that if any student wanted to see me, that student had priority over the principal or the vice-chancellor.
Good for you.
And I think that we all that. Now, with that little preaching here, if we take this webcast, which will be here, I think that every academic in London, possibly elsewhere, ought to listen to this webcast, because I think it will actually totally alter the way that we deal with our students. I think we all try to be good tutors. We have lots of things to do. We do research and we do our teaching, but I think a lot of us don't realise the problems that students are having, especially those who graduated some years ago. And looking around, in my count, I think we had contributions from 6 different universities here this evening. So there are lots of people who are very interested in that. So thank you very much for coming here. No disasters have happened at King's since you've been away from here, and we dragged you away. But thank you very much indeed for an absolutely superb lecture, and thank you for dealing with the questions so well and giving us so much to think about. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.